Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Frank and Candid. And today's edition, of course, today, Wednesday, 20th October 2020. Yesterday, we had a lively discussion about the Grenada Revolution, and I would have one or two Grenadians who live in St. Kitts called me afterwards and said, hey, they would like a continuation of that discussion because they'd like to make an input. But I told them that I already had a guest booked for today, so that might have to be when we have another open line, because after all, yesterday was just the anniversary of the death of Bishop and others, and on the 25th of October, the United States and others intervened, invaded, quote unquote. So we might follow up that discussion on the 25th. But ladies and gentlemen, today is another lovely day. We give God thanks for His mercies. Every day we hear about sickness and destruction and disease and death, and we have been spared. We have been listed among those who are destined for enjoying another day, and we give Almighty God thanks for His benevolence and mercy in that respect. I am proud and pleased to have as my guest today the fairly well known, I think. He was an educator involved in the field of education for a long time, and he calls in and makes what I consider to be some sensible interventions. Mr. Ira McMahon, and I want to thank you for being a part of the Frank and Candid family and for being here today, sir. Would you mind telling the audience what you're going to be discussing with us and them? And then we'll have you make your initial contributions. I'll be asking some questions as we proceed, and we should have a good time for the next 50 minutes or so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Blake. It's nice to be back in the studios of ZIZ. I was here previously looking at the role of the citizen in a democracy. And this time around...
How long ago was that, may I ask? More than a year ago?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Probably would have been more like 2 years or something like
that. Okay,
yeah.
I would have been in Cuba at the time, no doubt.
Yes, okay. And so this time around, I'm going to be looking at the role of civil society in a democracy. Okay? So that's what we're going to be about for the next 50 minutes, you said?
Yeah, more or less.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shall I proceed?
Carry on.
Yeah. Well, let's get some definitions out of the way first.
Definitely.
Yeah. The World Bank defines civil society as a wide array of non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations that have a presence in public life, expresses the interests and values of their members and others based on ethical, cultural, political, scientific, religious, or philanthropic considerations. Okay? That's the World Bank. The definition I like most, though, was taken from the Collins Dictionary. Who does that anymore? Look at dictionaries. You normally go to spell checkers and Wikipedia, right? Yeah.
Google and so on.
But anyway, Collins Dictionary says that refers to civil society as the organizations within a society that work to promote the common good. Now, I like that short definition because, for one, it's all-inclusive, and it has an admirable goal. Usually, though, civil society excludes government and for-profit sectors. So, essentially, they are NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
So, let's establish here, we are saying that civil society and NGOs, non-government organizations, are synonymous. Can we use them interchangeably, or is there a distinction, whether it be coarse or fine, between the two?
Well, we can use them interchangeably, right? Because, you know, non-governmental organizations include a whole range of organizations.
Right.
Right? And so in that sense, it's all-encompassing.
Okay. So, is my thinking correct that NGOs embrace a wider diversity of groups than civil society? And that NGOs can very well include organizations that are not very well structured not very well ordered. For example, youth groups, sports organizations. Would they be NGOs or would they be part
Those
of
would be
civil society?
NGOs. I would consider those NGOs as well.
But not necessarily part of civil society.
They are part of civil
Okay.
society.
All right.
That's why I said you can interchange
Interchange them, okay.
Yeah, okay.
So we heard that. Mhm.
Yes. Okay. But although the term usually is applied to organizations and groups, I think civil society can also be considered a state of being, an existence, a way of life. Now that's a little more controversial, but so you can take the name civil society literally, right? It suggests all the people practically living in harmony and discipline and orderliness, fairness, right? And so we can marry the two perspective and basically say civil society exists to secure and maintain rights and interests of all the people, be they economic or social or moral rights, okay, or moral concerns. Now, that's a tall order, yes, okay. And one may consider it, usurping government's role, because that's part of government role, okay, but governments are more likely to see their role as effecting what the majority of the populace want. And so very often you lose some people.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that as we proceed, you're going to clarify that as opposed to being seen as usurping government role, it complements.
It complements. It actually it does.
Right. Okay.
But some people would see the role of civil society and as opposed to government may be conflicting sometimes. They're often very much.
And that is quite in order. Once the conflict, of course, is managed.
But you're right. It should really complement. In the ideal situation, it often complements. But because of the very nature of civil society, they often have to look for the interests of people, marginalized people who society generally.
But based on your definition,
about.
It would seem fair to expect that some groups would have no confidence or have less confidence in government than they would in civil society, because
exactly.
For better or for worse, or for reasons legitimate or not, many persons have come to distrust government.
Exactly.
And we're talking about throughout the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why when I go through the rules, I think that is actually one of them. The fact that trust factor.
Right.
Okay, because civil society is seen as a kind of a moderating influence, trustworthy.
Right.
Okay.
And civil society, by definition or by practice or both, should be apolitical, or not necessarily.
Well, it depends on what you mean apolitical. Partisan political.
Okay.
If you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
But very often, civil society has to engage politically.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, because that's in the final analysis, that's very often how change is effective.
You're right. Definitely, I agree.
Yeah. And so, if you were to consider civil society, we should look at some of the roles that civil society would normally exercise. I think the first role would be to put limits on the powers of the state. Okay, to keep government accountable and transparent. They must challenge the abuses of authority and promote systems that foster integrity and good governance. That's the first role I consider very important for civil society.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt again, but I really thought that by now you would have listed some of the critical constituent members of civil society. I don't think you've done that yet.
Okay. By definition, that's why I started with definition.
Right, but
it includes everybody that is not, every organization that is not government.
Right, so I thought you'd give us some examples of that.
Okay.
Especially the relations to St. Kitts in
All right.
particular.
Okay. Christian Council,
Christian Council,
Chamber of Industry and Commerce.
Chamber of Industry and Commerce,
The professional associations like the Medical Association,
Teachers Union,
the judicial, what they call the lawyers,
legal,
what they call that one?
the Bar Association.
The Bar Association, right? Yeah, Christian Council.
Teachers Union, of course. I don't want
Teachers
to forget that.
unions,
Yeah.
unions
In general.
in general,
Yeah.
right? Youth groups,
Okay.
okay? All of those special interests, like, well, it shouldn't really be special interests but in fact, as it exists now, societies for the blind, the Society for the Blind,
Okay.
okay? All those groups, all right?
All right. Sure.
So that's why I said any group not necessarily not associated with government
Right.
or the business sector.
What about the Red Cross? Groups like the Red Cross?
That's a NGO as well.
Okay. I mean,
Okay.
that's okay, right.
And even though it does not, although we say in the definition that it does not include the business sector, certainly the organizations representing the business sector, okay, that look after, they have narrow interests, of course.
Yes.
Those would be considered. That would be considered an NGO as well.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
going back to the rules, so the first one is limit the power of the state. The second one is to monitor human rights and strengthen the rule of law. All right, it must be a watchdog for democracy. All right, assisting organizations like the World Justice Project, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Transparency International, that looks at press freedom and that sort of
Yes.
thing. Okay, that's another important role for civil society. It must monitor elections and promote free and fair elections throughout, and good electoral practices, right? Including things like campaign financing. So in other words, it must advocate for the overall quality and credibility of the democratic process.
Okay.
Okay. It should also be involved in the education of our citizens about their rights and responsibilities.
In a deliberate way? In a deliberate way? In other words, via organized activities, or this should happen almost...
By the way, no. It can be both. You can have an NGO that is specifically committed to that education. There's nothing wrong with that.
You know, in education, we speak of the taught curriculum, but we know that many persons learn far more from the hidden curriculum.
Yeah, informally, yes.
So this is what you're
So
saying
it's
here?
both.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. A combination.
Yeah. It should also build a culture of tolerance and civic involvement. Okay? And it definitely should represent marginalized groups, bringing them into the mainstream of society. Right? In other words, no one should be left behind or left out. It should also provide an alternative or complementary means to develop our communities outside of the state. Okay, that's why you may have so many volunteer organizations within the NGO community. All right. It should also advocate for diverse shades of thought and opinion, and the flow of information. Right. Civil society cannot operate in a closed society. Right. There must be freedom of information. It must build a constituency for economic as well as political and social reform. Because remember, these things, it's really something to aspire to when we talk about Singapore model or some kind of utopia. We'll never get there, okay? But you need to aspire to it. And so the NGOs should foster that kind of change over time, okay? When they see something going wrong, they're supposed to be able to pull us back, that sort of thing. But it's a dynamic, it should be a dynamic thing overall, okay? It must have a mediating role, okay? Like being an honest broker who everybody trusts. I think we spoke about that. People trust them to deliver impartiality, wisdom, and fairness and justice, okay? And the last one, it must have a moderating role, okay? It should temper the excesses of extremes in society, right? Because there's always that tendency, right? It has to guard against mob rule and cynicism and disillusionment and corruption and decadence. Okay, all those should be resisted. Okay, they should never be allowed to become the order of the day.
No matter who perpetrates them.
No matter who.
Right.
Those should be bedrock principles.
Right.
That
Irrespective of the source or the fount of those kinds of
right.
activities,
Exactly.
behaviors.
Right. So it's a tall order, and
Definitely.
yeah, and we can definitely say, but it has to be done, right? And what I'd like the listeners to consider is, in our context, in the St. Kitts Nevis context, is civil society fulfilling its role?
Well, that is one of the fundamental questions that we need to ask.
Yes.
If so, to what extent? And if not, why not? What are the factors that predispose to civil society performing, or rather not performing, its role based on these guidelines that you've presented?
Right.
And of course, callers are free to suggest additions or permutations of what you've suggested are the primary roles of civil society.
Or challenge them.
Or challenge them, of course, for that matter.
Right, yeah.
Definitely. So you're ready for
Absolutely.
Okay, well, you can call us now at 465-2555 as per usual here on Frank and Candid and talk to us about civil society and what it purports to do, what it ought to be doing in society in general, and if you want, we can focus it in St. Kitts and Nevis. Our question is, should or can civil society be policed? Because based on this wide array of responsibilities that you have assigned to it, to civil society, how can we be sure that civil society itself does not engage in excesses of any kind?
Right. Actually, I was going to leave that towards the end.
Okay,
but,
no problem.
No. But we can consider it now. The problem, one of the constraints of civil society is that it is not a structured. There are structures within the various components, but there is no overarching structure for civil society. So in a sense, it's not accountable to anyone. Whereas, for instance, government is accountable to the voters.
Yeah. And so on.
The business sector is accountable to the shareholders. Right? Civil society is that nebulous thing.
Right. It's more of an abstraction, if you wish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, since it's not accountable to everyone, to anyone,
civil society doesn't have its own constitution,
no,
so to speak.
It doesn't. It
Right.
doesn't. Right? And so, you know,
So consensus building is critical for civil society to operate.
Yes, absolutely.
And there must not only be a
But even though there should be consensus building, right? We have to be careful with that as well, because generally speaking, right, things can be considered black and white, and along the continuum there are varying shades of gray.
Absolutely.
But at some point, generally there can be consensus that, well, this is definitely black or this is definitely white. And that's where civil society is supposed to navigate that, right? And determine exactly where we should be. Remember, we said they're not facilitating extremes.
Right.
Right?
No, I'm looking practically at the situation where, for example, a government in power in St. Kitts, in St. Lucia, in the United States, in Britain, wherever, is contemplating a particular course of action, passing a certain law. And civil society, it is clear from general feedback that the population at large is not in favor, and there are ways and means of ascertaining and measuring that. So civil society decides, hey, let's call a discussion session. Let's discuss this matter and see what proposal we can present to the authorities. I'm just wondering if there is deep, almost irreconcilable differences within those groups that constitute civil society. The chamber wants this, and the Christian Council decides, no, I think this is the better way. And if there's no consensus in the end, does that mean that government is therefore free, whichever government is therefore free, it has a free hand to carry on, because there is no organized or unified, not just, we don't want to call it opposition, but there's no uniform or
there's no consensus. consensus.
agreement with respect to what the alternative should be?
Right. Well, in a situation like that, obviously,
Because I can see that actually happening.
yes, but in a situation like that, the government is who has the power. The government, and that's why I added on in a democracy.
Right. Okay, that's important.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
The government is accountable to the voters. If the government decides to take a course of action, even if it's unpopular, and governments must do that sometimes. I mean, governments are called upon to lead. You don't lead
Especially
by
in times
taking
of
a
crisis and so on.
yeah, you don't lead by taking a poll, right? You know, of course you have to take the temperature of the community, because eventually you're gonna have to
report to them.
report to them. Okay, so but in the fire analysis, somebody has to do it, but a government is taking a risk. Risk alienating itself if they do not take into consideration the opinions, the positions of the various,
the counter arguments, if you wish,
yes,
of civil
yeah,
society.
I mean, they do at their own risk
In a democracy.
in a democracy. Yeah.
So, for what we are arguing
And
here,
by the way, the people sometimes get it wrong, eh?
yeah, we have a caller.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to interrupt you from
Yeah,
time to
no
time to take
problem.
the call.
Yes, sure.
Good morning, caller.
Yes. A pleasant good morning, Dr. Blake.
Yes, sir.
How are you doing? Good, right?
You better believe it.
I'm doing good, even though it's humid. And good morning to your guest in there, Mr. McMahon.
Good morning, Cousin.
Right, yeah. Now, Mr. McMahon...
I realize you're one of my biggest fans.
Eh?
I realize you're one of my biggest fans.
Okay. I've been listening your opening remarks, and the amount of things that you said, that the, what do we call it again, the public sector or whatever.
Civil society.
Yeah, public society.
Civil society.
Right. We have a lot of responsibility on our hands, and that is to make sure we keep whichsoever government in check. But in the case of the farmer administration, Dr. Douglas administration, Dr. Douglas did a lot of things wrong. Number one, he refused to face the motion of no confidence. And then when he come on with the PEP, he said that he was going to put it up to 20%, but he stayed at 17 and he going to carry it up later. And then when he was warned Chasters about where he was going with the national debt, he said they come talking, we know what he said, they come talking about public debt. Public debt, me ask. Well, all of us were supposed to pull him up. Many of us pulled him up. But I never heard your voice, Mr. McMahon, pull up Dr. Douglas about his behavior. So tell me the reason why you didn't do it, because you were here in Sinkis. Have a good day.
As a moderator, I'm sorry. I am not prepared to engage in particular incidences that, in the minds of some, warranted intervention, not by you, but by civil society. Because I'm not so sure that you as an individual could have done anything, or certainly done much, in order to change the course of events. But I think the caller should have perhaps asked, what did civil society? Why was civil society silent or not as vocal as they ought to be? But I really am not prepared to have you as an individual, Iowa, the great McMahon, because we're not going to do that. Let's take another caller in the meantime.
Okay.
Hello, caller. Hello, caller. Yes. Okay, we lost him or her. Hello, caller. What's going on here? Okay, we're having some issues here, but right. So the question could very well be asked as we go back to. Hello, caller. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Blake.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, Mr. McMahon.
Good morning.
Yeah, I like his spirit, you know. He's very idealistic. Very idealistic.
That's how change comes, Mrs. Henry.
Yeah, you know.
Yeah. So I'm sure you're idealistic as well. You want better for the country, right?
Pragmatic.
Don't you?
I am pragmatic.
No. Pragmatism alone won't do it.
Now,
A lot of people do a lot of bad in the name of pragmatism.
Yeah, but
Anyway, go ahead.
let's
Yes,
make a
go
point.
ahead.
Yes.
now, what you see when you're asking civil society to get involved at the level, at certain level, you have to bear in mind the society, the culture, and the economy in which you reside. You're aware of that, right?
I'm listening.
When you have an economy where the government is the major employer or the provider of goods and services, and when you couple that with a rabid political atmosphere, it makes it difficult for some members of civil society to participate. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
No. In Jamaica, I guess you know, you talk about integrity in public life. There is a civic society group, Trevor Monroe and the others. Some of them are intellectuals and so, right? But still, these are people who are not dependent on the government for their livelihood. So therefore, they are able to fill that role. It is possible in St. Kitts, a lot of retirees, intellectual retirees, because remember I say, when your livelihood tied up and there is very little scope for private enterprise, people not going to go to bed just to talk because you want them to talk. They can express it, but everything comes at a cost. And our people are not readily willing and able to back up. In fact, they will hear on political platforms of all kinds attacks, direct attacks on civil groups that have tried to play the role that you have expounded. And how are they rewarded? You spoke about the Bar Association. When they speak, if they're not saying what you want to hear, I don't mean you personally, yeah? When they are saying what the government, whoever they are, or political party, don't want to hear, I mean the amount of verbal attack backed up by party supporters, slander, character assassination, not even to mention the church. They slander the church, slaughter it. People I find around here only want civil society to be active when the issue concerns them.
Okay, Mrs. Henry, take another minute. Maximum.
Right?
No, let her finish. Let her finish, sorry.
So I am saying we have got to be honest. When you are asking people to put themselves out on a limb, to be slaughtered, when there are other people who are independent, who should be getting in groups. Why do you think I talk on the radio? On nobody nothing. Nobody have anything on me. I never asked a politician for a favor.
Okay.
Right? So I am saying, what you're saying sounds good, but it is idealistic. And you must encourage political parties and activists to stop attacking the civil society.
Okay, Mrs. Henry, just before you go, Mrs. Henry, just before you go, Mr. McMahon has a question for you, and then we're going to ask you to...
Go ahead, Mr. McMahon.
Yeah. Basically, what you're saying is that you agree with the roles of civil society. You just, well, shall we say, making excuses for why it can't happen here or why it doesn't happen here? But do you agree that it is something to aspire to?
Hello? Okay, she's gone.
She's gone. Okay.
All right.
That was the question.
No, what I got from is 2 points she made here, that the socio-political economic environment is important in determining the actions, responses, behaviors of civil society, and we can't disagree with that. She also mentioned, in my view, from my interpretation, that civil society is stronger when its members are not dependent on government. And even though members of civil society may be engaged in some of the institutions which you refer to, the church and so on, they might still very well be dependent on government for their survival in terms of their being employed by the state. But Mrs. Henry seems to be suggesting that when persons are not so dependent, then civil society is stronger. So, I don't know if you have a response to that before we go back to the lines?
Yes, well, actually, it's probably, if somebody on the line? No? Okay. Well, actually, Mr. Blake, maybe this is an appropriate time to go into the constraints on civil society, because I think that would answer some of her questions, right? One of the most important constraints, or limiting constraints, is the fact that we have an unhealthy political culture, okay? There is intimidation, there is victimization, there is divisiveness. Okay, that is a big constraint on civil society. And then there is the malaise and disillusionment and cynicism among the populace itself. Okay, after a while they get tired and say, oh, they're all the same, nothing will change. That kind of disillusionment. And that is also bad that's a bad environment for civil society to be acting in. Then there's the funding, right? It doesn't bring in money. The roles that I've mentioned doesn't really bring in money. It's not seen as directly contributing to the wealth creation, to the wealth of the society, and so it's not given priority, right? People don't consider. For instance, they don't make the connection between civil society and doing better in society. Okay, if we had the civil society effecting its role, the society as a whole would be better off. Okay, but people do not make that connection, right? Then there's of course the fact that there's little reward for people's efforts in civil society. So it doesn't attract volunteers or support. In fact, people are more likely to have to sacrifice much. They're usually middle of the roaders, and so they become roadkills. There's just not any reward for being part of civil society.
Let's take another caller in the meantime. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Blake, good day.
Good morning to you.
Yes, good morning. Interesting discussion. Now, the World Bank has a definition for civil society.
Which Mr. Mark Mohan has already advanced.
Hello?
Yeah, which Mr. Mark Mohan has already advanced. He has already presented that.
He gave the World Bank definition. Okay.
Yes, he did.
So it deals with, of course, faith-based organizations and different things like that.
Yes.
And so it covers a wide span of organizations. I know that, as I would say, that it sort of gained momentum in the 80s when you had a lot of these civil wars going on in various countries. And you had to have a sort of another, another state, and another sector.
Another force, if you wish.
Another force to help to put the parties, to focus on that, to help to bring the parties together, to avert and reduce the war elements and things like that. But in our society here, where we go along sort of merrily, we have a lot of various organizations which perform a very important role, because government cannot do everything. Exactly. And you have, as I mentioned, about the faith-based, you have charitable organizations, we have the Red Cross, we have, even things like clubs and so on, and they focus on the good in that particular group. Now, I heard Mr. McMahon say that they're not responsible to anybody, or something to that effect. But in fact, they are responsible to their executive or to their members.
Right.
And it depends, of course, on the type of structure that each of these organizations would have. You have a constitution, you have what have you, and so on, and they are elected. And so they're responsible to them to carry out the specific focus of that group. And in my view, the more you have dealing with certain things, because the government can't cover everything, and you don't want one civil society organization that covers everybody and then you have problems there. You still would need to have very focused groups that deal with aspects of the society and their, concerns and their desires and so on. So that's helpful there. In terms of the impact on government's role, that's a different. That I should put it this way. Sometimes there are instances where they have to come to the fore. And we've had it in the case, we had an incident like in the 90s, and then you had the private sector, along with civil society organizations, in particular the church, that came together to come to some understanding. So you will always, and maybe the legal
Fraternity.
associations, and so those can be helpful. But I think generally, we are doing pretty well so far. But maybe, yes, from time to time, we need some of these organizations which are not dependent on government to come and speak up on certain issues. But of course, at one time, one set may give preference to another thing and another side. So you'll always have that.
Definitely.
But hopefully, let us have democracy working. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. McMahon, I think that culture's question was relevant to the extent that it referred to civil society, like I said, and not to you as an individual. Because definitely there were times during the regime of the illustrious Robert Bradshaw, the Dr. Kennedy Simmons, Dr. Denzel Douglas, and even currently, there are times when civil society perhaps should have been more vocal, more visible, more audible, more palpable.
Yes.
And I think that is the question that is relevant. And so, based on that, my question to you is, can you pinpoint any particular incident, any particular case, particularly here in St. Kitts Nevis, or perhaps elsewhere, where civil society's intervention contributed, if not exclusively, largely, to an amicable solution to a problem that threatened to upset the social equilibrium or the economic fabric of the nation? Can you point us to any example where civil society intervened, and as a result of its intervention, things were settled in a way that benefited the society at large, in a way that contributed to enhancement of the public good?
Well, the obvious one that comes immediately to mind is the 1993
Four Seasons Accord.
Four Seasons Accord, right? That absolutely made a difference in terms of diffusing what was a really,
potentially,
it had the potential to really destroy the country, right? So that is a case, and that's what I mean. Now, there is always the problem of yes, you diffuse the situation then, but have the accords, for instance, been followed upon, right? And that's where consistency came. I think the last caller made that point, that depending on you can change depending on civil society. Civil society decides on intervention when it wishes to, and sometimes when it should, it doesn't. Right? One has to be consistent, and the fact that the various constituent members of civil society are accountable to their structure,
their immediate
immediate organization. That itself does not mean that civil society as a whole has any kind of structure and is accountable to anybody. It isn't. All right, and that is why, for instance, each of the member organization have their own internal dynamics. Okay, and very often they're very diverse. And very often they have very diverse interests, and very often they reflect the same sort of dynamics that are in the wider society. The polarization, the
after all, civil society is a microcosm
exactly
of society.
Okay, so it's very difficult for consensus building to take place. Okay, but the fact is I am not so sure I agree with the last caller that we're doing fine, and that's
depends on one definition.
Yes,
one's perception of
that's actually something I've noticed, that we have a tendency to self-congratulations. You're too self-congratulatory. You know, we are satisfied with
less than excellence.
yes. Okay. That's not how you build a Singapore. Okay.
No, but one would argue, for example, as I do in education sometimes, that if a fellow is naturally bright and he keeps getting 80 and 90%, and so every term he's on the principal's list, every term he gets a prize for first, second, or third place. All right, fine. But what about the guy who starts off at 20% and then moves up to 40, and by the end of the year he's at 60? Isn't he more rewarding, more deserving of a reward?
Again,
so it depends on.
I see what you mean.
Right.
I see what you mean.
Where I'm coming from.
But again, one of the things
we have a caller. Let's take him and hold your thought. Let's caller.
Yes. Now I asked Mr. McMahon a question, you know, which Wheeler brought up. You need people with expertise or whatever in certain area. For example, you have Transparency International. Is he aware of that organization?
He mentioned it in his opening remarks, Mrs. Henry. He made reference to Transparency International and Amnesty International and so on in his opening remarks. He did.
Yes, I am saying what we need are local groups.
Of similar ilk.
Yeah.
we do
Those
have
are people who would understand. You don't want people that jumping in.
We do have. I think.
Politics
No, let him finish, please. Sorry.
pervasive in this
That's my
place
style.
here. You are suspicious of some civil society group when they speak. Because when you look at the people are aligned, people tend to be aligned. We need honest people who understand the issues before they speak or jump in. Or they themselves can be get themselves mixed up and confused, and they don't add to the system. Now, the one you talk about with the Christian Council in 1993. I mean, the chaos we had, right? And 1993, they signed it, and then you had the election in 1995.
No, they have election in 1993.
No. There was.
Oh, you mean the following elections in 1995? Oh, sure. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
They had the battle and stone throwing in 93. And in 1995...
You mean the freedom fighters? Yeah.
They had election again. And all of the... Let's sectorize it up to now. They signed, you know, you're part of the accord. Where were the groups? Some groups attempted to say, well, why can't they, and what they get? I mean, we have got to be honest. We need independent, unaligned people to form specific groups to deal with what he's asking. You want to talk about conspiracy, corruption, and you need groups. Are you willing? Again, I'm asking you, are you willing to start or to get persons to join with you to form such a group? You're asking people who often are unaware of even some of the meaning of the things you're talking about. What is corruption?
I didn't get you.
Yeah, okay, Mr.
What is corruption? Integrity in public life. What does it mean? Even though they hear the bill. How does it affect private life?
Okay.
All right then.
Thank you. Mr. McMahon, we're going to do this. Of course, you're going to respond to Mrs. Henry. But we want to spend the remaining minutes that we have, 10 or so minutes, focusing on the future. In terms of going forward. How should we restructure? How should we organize civil society? What should civil society be doing, for example, during COVID right now? What should it be doing? How can we strengthen the organization, the role, the function of civil society to make sure that its record becomes one of achievement and success as opposed to one of shame and failure? So you can respond to Mrs. Henry, and then I want you to look ahead. How do we proceed? How do we build going forward?
Well, actually, I would respond to Mrs. Henry by saying that is exactly what we should be doing, looking ahead.
You want to take this caller now?
Okay,
Let's do that. Because we're going to stop receiving calls in a few. Hello, caller.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Blake and Mr. Mack.
Yes,
Morning,
sir.
morning.
Yeah, how you all doing? Very good program, very interesting. Just a comment.
Oh, this is my good friend. Yeah, okay. Carry on, Sam.
Yeah, it is well established that the best way for advancement and development of a country is good governance, right? It has nothing to do with a small country or a big country or any middle-sized country.
It's not a function of size.
Not a function of size. That is universal. Good governance, right? And it was said by the Secretary General the other day, the UN Secretary General, that the greatest guarantee of good governance is a vibrant civil society, including a free, independent media and responsible social media platforms that encourage healthy debate, right? And civil society has nothing to do with any special group. You don't develop or form a special group for civil society. Civil society are the non-governmental organizations. They are well established. The church, the bar association, medical association, whoever you have. And their role is to look at what's happening on a principled basis. And what is right, what is wrong is wrong. And it has nothing to do, basically, you have to be able to make a decision that you are committing yourself to standing up for what is right.
And this
that is how a country advances and progress.
Yeah, and Sam, these individual groups can make those interventions singly by themselves, not necessarily coming together.
Exactly.
Okay, right. That's critical.
Exactly.
That's critical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is the advancement of all the countries around the world. Any country that has made progress, that is how they take one. You don't set up a special group. There's nothing like that. A special group for what? There's no special group. There is the groups, the civil society. In some countries, there are more than others because of size and all of that. But the groups are basically the same. And the principle of advancement is good governance. And the role of society, the role of civil society, is to make sure that the government follows those things: transparency, accountability, integrity in public life, professional civil service, and all those things. All they have to do, you have benchmarks for those things. You know what is accountability, you know what is transparency. You're not making up them things. Those are definitions, that we have all the time. And that is how we go forward. And the final thing I want to say is that that is the role of all citizens of every country. You want the best for your country because you have a responsibility to pass on your country better to the next generation, better than you inherited it. In fact, Mr. Blake, I want to remind you of a quotation you had shared with me sometime.
Sure.
That we are not inheritors of anything. We are custodians of our civilization, and we have to pass it on more advanced and more developed.
To the next generation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I particularly love that quotation that he provided from the Secretary General of the United Nations, where the greatest guarantee of good governance is a healthy, strong civil society.
Absolutely.
And I want to add to that because the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, is having a regional conference in Chile as we speak. Started yesterday, ends tomorrow. And this is what the FAO has explained in a press release. We cannot advance towards the transformation of society without civil society. Goes on to say, the inclusion of civil society organizations and social movement is critical in the decision-making process. That's the Food Organization speaking right now. So let's look ahead quickly. We only have about 5 more minutes in terms of St. Kitts and Nevis. What are your suggestions with respect to strengthening civil society going forward?
Well,
and Mrs. Henry was challenge to you to ask if you're willing to spearhead or to be a part of a movement that ensures that we end up with a kind of strong civil society to which Sam made reference as quoted as voiced by the Secretary.
If she would join me, I would.
So only on that condition?
If she would join me, I would. Because you see, Mr. Blake, right? One of the most frustrating things is when people make make excuses or give all sorts of reasons.
Or demands.
Not so much demands,
Okay.
but all sorts of reasons why things should not change, why the status quo will be the same, why we can't aspire to be better. Okay? Sure, you can have all kinds of excuses why things should not change. But then where does that leave us? Where does that leave the next generation? Okay? And I'm saying that sure, there are problems, there are constraints, but we have to move forward. Okay? Ambassador Condor hit the nail on its head when he said good governance systems would all but guarantee that we have the kind of society we want. Okay? The kind of environment in which civil society can function and bring about that change. Okay? And the thing is, practically everybody, including Mrs. Henry, knows what good governance is, knows that it will be better for us, but for some reason there is a blockage, there is all sorts of reasons why it can't happen. It's in the manifestos for all the parties.
Right.
Right?
So
the society generally, the electorate generally, is gonna have to demand that they fulfill these kinds of promises, getting good governance systems in place, and stop the pussyfooting. I mean, basically, what happens is they put them there, and then when they get into office, they do all sorts of have all sorts of delaying tactics and watering down, and have legislation with no teeth to frustrate the process.
do you think it's ever possible for us to arrive at a state where we can say, oh, the government is doing such a fine job, almost such a perfect job, that the whole of that civil society becomes redundant? Do you think that is possible?
No, I don't think that is possible. That's why I say it should aspire to it. And let me say one more thing. One of the things that I'm criticized for is people say, man, you're so negative. The thing is, right, this is not kindergarten, right? This is not a place where you stroke people's egos. These are big people in government who are responsible for people's lives and livelihood. You don't get better by focusing on what you're doing right. You get better by focusing on what you're doing wrong. You are a teacher.
I am. I am a teacher.
Right, well, you are. Right? Who do you pay more attention to? The guy who's going to be getting everything right?
I just made that point, to pay attention to the weaker one.
Exactly. Right? And so that is where we have to go. I mean, it's a work in progress, and civil society just can't just abandon its role. Right? It must become more visible, more vocal, more viral if our country is ready to progress. Right now, civil society, I think, it's too laid back, too lethargic and too inconsistent and too timid, right? So the people who are leading civil society, they have to be prepared to break the eggs to make the omelette, okay? They have to be prepared not to accept the status quo, right? Otherwise, we're not going to go anywhere. And of course, there's a responsibility for the people making up that society to demand better, to demand that civil society, government, and everybody else, business and everybody else, be held accountable from top to bottom. That is what's going to bring change.
Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic that this is going to be a reality? I mean, right now it's a desire. Mm-hmm. Are you confident? Are you optimistic that sooner or later that will become a reality?
Well, I said sooner rather than, hopefully sooner rather than later. Because if we don't get this right, I could see future generations cursing us for the nonsense we've been doing.
History will not absolve us.
History will not absolve us. That's the long and short of it. Because what we're doing now, we may not see it right away, but what we're doing now is going to have consequences for our future development. Right? We can't just sit back and watch other people pass us by when we're in a leadership position right now. We just can't do that.
Okay. A final sentence, because we're out of time. A final
Well,
sentence, a final thought from you?
Simply, I'm just appealing for civil society to perform its role.
Okay.
If that happens, we'll be surprised at how quickly change happens and how it will be changed for the better. Okay?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to Mr. Ivan McMahon, my guest today on Frank and Candid. And of course, thank you very much for those of you. Thanks very much to those of you who called in and engaged him in discussion. We believe that St. Kitts has done well. We believe it can do better. And the argument here is that civil society, if it were more active, if it were involved in a more robust manner in ensuring that things proceed the way they ought, we would experience that progress on an even greater scale.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Mr. McMahon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Do have a fine Tuesday, and we look forward to continuing the discussion, other discussions on Frank and Candid. Until such time, do the right thing.